with different sort of programs and articles and so on if you're interested. So I mean, there's kind of two approaches, I guess. One that we've been talking about, which is if you're trying to improve like infrastructure decisions or managerial decisions, or improve is maybe the wrong word, if you're trying to make the process better. You know, you can think of it from the point of view of templates for conducting meetings, templates for conducting project evaluations, and so on and so forth. And the other one to think about is to think about individual managerial decision making. So there's obviously a lot of people interested in that. I teach a course in LSE, or teach part of a course in LSE on where we've got like executives coming in from all over the world to basically improve their knowledge of behavioural economics and behavioural science and go back into the organisations that they're going into. And it is an interesting one about how you would train people to improve their own decisions. It's a difficult one. I certainly think everyone should try it. I certainly spend a lot of time reading these things myself. So like definitely these types of things, like going through checklists of assumptions, is one way to do it. In the email I'll send a few links to other ones that you might be interested in. I was talking to Carl at the break about how to work out your optimism discount factor, for example, which is, some of you won't have one, but someone like myself will have a tendency to be over-optimistic about what I can do in a time window. So how do you work out, you know, what in your past decisions that has been? And you often see it. I mean, I've seen really, really good decision makers who have just got this real ability to know, or at least have a good sense when something has become over-optimistic, and just to jump in with a good heuristic to bring it back. And I think that to me is a good summary of a lot of what those managerial executive training courses are trying to teach people. It's to be aware of biases that they're carrying into different types of decision processes and try to train themselves. And that, as I said, many of you could do this without needing to be told the behavioural science language of it, but I think when you see the language around it, it becomes quite useful. As I said, there's also a lot of software for these types of things. I think this is, as I said, this is Kahneman, who's the top person in the area, trying to summarise what all these decision aids are doing. But it could be just a matter of actually just training yourself to think like this, or it could be a matter of formally embedding these things into, and as I said, there's everything from just embedding them into meetings to the McKinseys of the world who do programs on executive decision making and those types of things, or formally engaging with some of the big players that work on these types of things. So that's stage 3. If you want to think about it in that, we're still at -1. So I want to talk about Swift. I sort of do a bit of an abrupt turn. This is a very big area. I have to admit it's the one I struggled on the most. I've talked to Ryan about this and we're going back and forth about grounding it a bit, but I still think I've got hopefully got some interesting material for you on it. It is a thorny one, so if you're embedding change processes, if you're trying to get staff engaged with initiatives from management, how do you approach these? And I've been looking at various different literatures trying to condense it for DAA to do it. And I'll give you just, I think this is probably the most preliminary. I was able to find very concrete material on the other areas, but let's go through it anyway. So one thing to think about is, let's say you're trying to get staff engaged in either a change process, or get them to uptake some new process, or uptake some new initiative, or whatever it is. So one thing I did, I just went back to basics, which is how do you actually change people's behaviour more generally. So this was a group of scholars in the UK. They were asked by the government to come up with, give us the 9 ways that can change people's behaviour. And they reviewed thousands and thousands of documents. So one of my colleagues has a criteria that has 105 different ones of these. So very hard to make it into an acronym if you don't speak Welsh. So they managed to get it down to 9. Now I'm sort of this was my Hail Mary pass at this, which is, let's go back to basics. If you're really talking about thorny, long run, unchangeable, hard to change behaviours, like go into the sort of foul rag and bone shop of the heart, as we call it. Like just go into like how do people's behaviour, how do people respond to a call to change? Now, there's lots of discussions that we've already had about making sure it's the right change and making sure that things have been appraised properly at management level and all of that type of stuff. But let's imagine that you do have something that you think this is both good for the staff and good for the organisation, and there's not an obvious reason. So if the staff engagement process is we want to pay you less, there might be completely rational reasons why the staff might not want to go along with that. If the engagement issue is that we've got these legitimate proposals that are not flying for whatever reason, how do you use a set of tools to really break down what might be happening? So this is, as I said, a group of UK scholars formulated this framework, which then led to the setting up of the thing called the Behavioural Insights team in the UK. So they're currently they've done something like 850 trials across about 150 organisations at this stage, and they mostly use a version of this. Now what they actually found was this was actually slightly too much, and I'll talk about the other framework in a second. But this is a very interesting brainstorming tool. So it's literally just a way of going, let's take something that we've got a program that we've tried to roll out, and we just can't figure out why people are not going for it. We can't figure out why people haven't engaged with it. So one is who's communicating it. So that's the ultimate one. So who is the actual front person? So I finished some projects recently looking at what happens when politicians front recycling projects, for example. So obviously it's good for some people if they know a minister's involved, they think it's more credible. For others, you know, even if they're reasonably pro-environmental, if they see the minister's face, they immediately think something's wrong. And that's one thing to test. Are there particular messengers? So Carl in SEI, they've been doing some really good work on community folks as sort of messengers for energy initiatives. So if you're in Thurles, where I'm from, maybe hearing the Minister for the Environment say, you know, you should retrofit your house doesn't really mean much to you, whereas seeing, you know, the local primary school headmaster or headmistress say, you know, you really should do this, and here's examples of what I've done, or seeing the guy across the road giving you an example. So I think that's one thing to think about messenger. Incentives, I could spend a lot of time thinking about this, but so whether things are a loss or a gain, whether there's different types of risks involved, how incentives can be framed. Norms, so I did a session with another regulator recently on what is normal in different contexts. So I guess what sort of organisational norms are there? What do staff think is the normal thing to do in a situation? How could those be shifted? Default options. So, I mean, in many cases, what will determine whether somebody engages with something is if it's automatic. So the best pension intervention ever invented was simply to opt people into pensions and let them opt out if they didn't want to. I've seen literally hundreds of examples where that becomes the most important behavioural lever. And many examples also where you're not allowed to push it for all sorts of reasons, but it's one issue you should always be thinking about, which is to what extent, firstly, to what extent have norms formed in the organisation about what is the right thing to do, and then secondly, to what extent are the default options shaping people's behaviour, so people become highly attached to something simply because it's what we do now. Well, can it be changed, and what's the role? I mean, in your case, you've obviously got industrial relations sort of context in how you shape these types of things, but I think we often overestimate how strong people's preferences are towards things until they change, and you realise actually people will reset quite quickly. And I can go through all the rest of them, but like just in the interest of time, I think those are the big. I mean, not just because they're at the top, but those do tend to be the big ones, like norms and defaults. So actually, really digging in to those types of things. I mean, it's also interesting to think about salience. So why is it the case that some aspects of a process generate so much heat versus others? Like why did they become the things that are so psychologically important? And I'm actually realising now why the Behavioural Insights team moved away from Mindspace, because it takes too long to get down to E. So they changed it to this. What they argue, so if you want to get somebody to adopt something in any change process, they've turned into a very large multinational organisation at this stage now by, well, I say very large, by the standards of what we do, 150 to 200 staff working on this in the space of a couple of years. So, and it's mainly this framework they work off, which is if you want to get somebody to adopt something, make it easy for them to adopt it, So examine any barriers that they might have, whether it's form filling. So Sunstein estimates he saves the American government about $80 billion in just reducing the amount of form filling that administrative staff had to engage in. Similarly, from the workplace point of view, people spend a lot of time on complicated form filling, so make it easier for people to engage, make it attractive for them, both in terms of incentives, but also in terms of looking at in detail what it is that they're wanting, make it timely, so try to align what it is that staff, what it is that you're wanting staff to do with the timings in which they're making these types of decisions, and make it social. So again, you can think about the different mechanisms, but making it such peer effects are a very big shaper of human behaviour. So the extent to which other people are doing it, the extent to which you can see other folks like you doing it. So there's a huge literature now on social proof. So if you're looking for people to engage in a process, showing them that similar people to them have engaged in it and found it good is a lot more informative to them than simply providing them with numbers. So as I said, Rowan asked me to show you some tools. I mean, that one, we don't have time to do it today, but like for any given process, this is a very good brainstorming tool to go through, and I think you will not find many examples of projects that you won't find things that you can change based on these criteria. So I guess in terms of motivating and engaging staff, obviously the financial incentives, there's nothing new to behavioural economics. This is the main one. The one thing to think about is intrinsic motivation, or the lack of it, and to what extent do these? Is there a culture in an organisation of folks actually wanting to work for the organisation, being proud to work for the organisation? Those types of things. How might they be improved? So communication. So the one I want to focus on a little bit from the behavioural perspective is the complexity of the information. So, as I said, there's just many staff engagement issues that relate to complex interfaces. I certainly think of my own organisation, the amount of things that we ask staff to do that involve them having to fill out very complicated forms, and it creates a huge amount often of resentment. You get a lot of emails back going, I just haven't got time to do this. It's not so bad in Ireland, I have to admit. We're better. When I worked in the UK, you could literally spend most of your day filling out forms if you set your mind to it. It was a very complex administrative environment to work. So I think reducing complexity. So Sunstein has written several books, basically saying if you could do one thing on the world, it would be to reduce the amount of paperwork that people have to fill in during their day job, and in not just paperwork, but I guess how complicated are the processes that you're asking staff to engage in? Might simplification have an effect? And then this other one is workplace wellbeing initiatives. I gave the keynote, I shouldn't call it a keynote, I gave the opening talk at IBEX conference on workplace wellbeing interventions. Simon Harris gave the other talk, and then some very interesting people doing various workplace interventions stood up, and I had the rather unenviable duty of standing up and saying, we don't actually know if any of these work. So there's now quite a big literature saying, I mean, I'd love to be able to say, you know, here's 5 workplace wellbeing interventions that really improve staff engagement and so on and so forth. The answer is we don't have them. That was a very difficult message to deliver at a conference, to launch the workplace wellbeing intervention one. I did it with a bit of style. I said, you have a historic opportunity to come up with one. We call that game framing in the trade. But I actually sort of mean that. I mean, in the sense of, it is a bit liberating to think that, you know, and if you Google it on the internet, you'll see people saying, you know, provision of yoga and all of these types of things in the workplace will lead to happier, more productive staff. I don't want to dismiss them. So in the reviews that were done in the UK, staff tend to like them. So there is evidence that staff will say, you know, I'm happy my employer did this, and so on and so forth, and they can be nice. There's no evidence they improve retention or productivity or those types of things. So I think when you're thinking about workplace wellbeing interventions as a way of motivating staff, it's worth taking them down and sort of. So I mean, it's a bit of a negative message to give out, but frankly, I think it's a realistic one at this stage with that work. So Yeah, that's not very uplifting. They don't work, but they're certainly worth looking at. And I think while they may not have top-line effects on productivity, yeah, I mean, I don't want to dismiss them out of hand either, because we are relatively early stage in this. Yeah, I'm sort of practicing my speech from the last time. Sorry, that bullet, that shouldn't have been there like that. So the other thing would be reference effects. It's very interesting, a very interesting video on YouTube where you've got, and this is humans do it, children do it, we all do it. And there's a great one where monkeys are sharing, are being given sort of grapes and biscuits. So each of the monkeys been given a grape, and they can see that each of them has been given a grape, then one of them is given a sort of stale biscuit, and he goes mental. He basically, having been used to that equal treatment with the other one, perceiving that he's being treated unequally, even though it's a relatively small thing, makes him very frustrated. And I think that's a very interesting one to spot, that sometimes small differences between staff at relatively similar levels can be experienced as magnitudes higher than the actual absolute amount of income. And it's worth always teasing through those things. You've seen it in so many contexts, there's a huge amount of literature about it, that relatively small amounts of income differentials or working conditions differentials between groups can have disproportional effects. Again, I'd love to give you an off-the-shelf solution to that, but I think it's just recognizing it when you see it, and the effect that it can have on an organization, because you can have somebody who will literally disengage completely for something that they mightn't have even noticed had it been an across-the-board difference in income. So I think it's worth brainstorming that if you're thinking about it. The importance of recognition. So how do you use intrinsic rewards? And it'd just be interesting to think about the ones that you already have and maybe think about them anew. This is maybe a little bit of a toy example, literally. So this is Dan Ariely. If you ever get a chance to read his books, he's very charismatic. I had to speak after him once in Warwick University. It was a very prestigious thing. I think someone cancelled at the last minute and I got invited. So Gordon Brown spoke, then Dan Ariely spoke, and then I spoke, and I wanted to bounce onto the stage full of enthusiasm so I wouldn't get upstaged, and forgot that there was a step. So this huge audience just sees this Irish guy sort of hurtling from the wings and then popping down in front of the stage. And there was police in there and everything, so I stood up and just sort of wandered, limped over to the podium, and I was like, yes, as I've just demonstrated, people do sometimes make suboptimal decisions, but I actually met him again. I spoke with him at a nightclub in Kilkenny, David McWilliams. Actually, can you imagine me in a nightclub? But Dave McWilliams does this thing on economics and comedy. So yeah, I had to stand up and do a sort of stand-up routine. I gave a history of behavioural economics as seen through the lens of the show Father Ted. And so you're probably all thinking, oh, we should have done that today. That would have been that would have been much better practice. But Ariely is very well worth looking at. Really interesting guy. But he's looked an awful lot at organisational decision making, also a lot about staff motivation, and a lot about. I mean, his real idea is that sometimes it's the meaning of money. It's how it's communicated to people. It's how it's sort of like that money is not just a financial incentive. In this case, it's just a simple experiment where they were paying people to do a task. So it was a mundane task where they had to sort pieces of paper, like they had to solve little problems on pieces of paper. One group is told, we're going to shred these immediately after you do it. It doesn't matter. We're just testing how many you'll do. One group are told, we'll just put them on a pile, and we're using them for something. And the other group is told, put your name on it and we'll talk to you about it afterwards. And it's a very simple experiment, but it's illustrative of what they're trying to get at, like recognition. So in this case, again, not a very inspiring story, but that people would keep going a lot more at these tasks if they were recognized for it, if they could give a sort of personal identity to it, and so on. So there's quite a lot of work on that, trying to figure out when people will take ownership of a task, when they will feel it's something they're being recognized for, and so on. So this was, as I said, Ariely's thing about the importance of feedback, and so on. But in terms of communication, again, like I was saying to Ruan, there isn't, like in some of the other areas, you can think of much more concrete sort of ways of doing some of these things. I think with some of this, it's trickier. I would say from the behavioural economics perspective, inequalities between groups, as I said, really matter a lot. So understanding those would be really important. Understanding the role of intrinsic motivation versus extrinsic incentives is important. And then in terms of communication, so reframing, so how you can, look at something that's causing a psychological block and reframe it in a different way. So in the very simple one, gain framing versus loss framing, so looking at the benefits of something rather than the cost. The problem if you do that incorrectly, it can come across as insincere. But I think sometimes it is important to look at, well, what is it that the staff member is actually getting from your communication that's leading them to think this is negative. I guess the problem is that for the staff member is not just interacting with you, the staff member is interacting with a whole psychological history of interactions with an organisation, so they're bringing a huge amount of norms, implicit default options, all of these types of things to the scenario. So I think it would be glib to say that you can correct for all that with a simple reframing. But I think, as I said, I think it's certainly worth thinking about some of these types of things. And then, so coming back to my last negative message on staff engagement, workplace wellbeing intervention. Now, I do want to be careful how I say this, because I'm not saying don't engage with IBEX work in workplace intervention. I think they're doing some really interesting stuff. But I think it's worth looking. It's worth putting in place. This was my conclusion. It's worth putting in place a mechanism for evaluating what you're trying to do with them and whether it's achieving that. So I actually did manage to say something relatively inspiring at the talk, which is I said, if you think of workplace wellbeing interventions as being a little bit of an add-on to HR, then you'll spend a few quid on them and you'll tick that box and you'll get certified, and at the end of the day you'll be able to say I'm a decent employer. Like, if you genuinely think of them as a transformative thing, as something that you're willing to spend a substantial chunk of your organization's budget on, if you really, really believe that these are going to make workers happier, more productive, keep them in the organization, bring them on site the organization, then that's a much more ambitious thing. But ultimately it's a bigger and better goal in many respects. I would say at the moment, and I do mean this, I think organizations would be unwise to totally sort of ignore these simply because at present the ROI on them doesn't look too promising from a pure productivity perspective. I think engaging with them but having a sort of good solid sense of what the markers of success are is a good thing. And then the other thing, just to come back to Sunstein's plea, and this is something I've been pushing a lot in UCD, which is, are there ways, so these are ways of finding quick wins as to use Carl's parlance, are there ways of reducing paperwork burden, reducing administrative complexity? And as I said, there's quite a lot of templates, for example, for going through forms to reduce them in terms of their complexity and making them more understandable and so on. Are there aspects of worker dissatisfaction that relate to the fact that they don't understand what they're being asked to do, or that they don't understand what their incentive structures are, and those types of things? Again, probably reasonably decent evidence that there's wins to be had in those areas. So sorry that was maybe a little less, maybe not as upbeat as some of the other sessions, but I think it is a thornier problem. So I think what I would suggest would be, think about areas of staff engagement that are particularly thorny. Think about how behavioural insights might work in those areas. I think it's a case, and this goes back to what Carl said, and again I'm going to make one more stab at saying workplace wellbeing interventions have a place, which is, it's an area where testing, I think, is particularly important, because you really don't have that many off-the-shelf solutions to something like this. And these are things that each organisation will experience in a very, almost in a unique way. So it's really an interesting area for testing things that might work. So what I suggest, if you wanted to maybe spend about 5 minutes on staff engagement, and then what I will do is just ask each table just to spend a couple of minutes reflecting on the 3 different areas. So just, if you have 1 or 2 or 3 points, you don't need to have loads and loads of things. So just general reflections. Now, I'm totally violating everything I said earlier on, which is asking people to give open reflections isn't necessarily a great way of feedback. So what I've also asked Ruan to do is to send individually a form that you can complete either anonymously, or if you want to put your name in it, that's up to you, so that we could get other views as to what you thought about it afterwards, which will go to Ruan rather than to me. So that will give you a chance. If you saw something about this today and you thought, I really think that was a good idea, or that was a bad idea, but I don't want to say it in front of folks, or I feel nervous about expressing the view, you can do it in that particular way. But so yeah, let me give you a couple of minutes on staff engagement, and then I'll move on.